Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're stepping into a world so quiet, so dimly lit, and so ink-stained that your modern brain might short-circuit. You're walking through a stone hallway, cool and drafty, and you smell oddly burnt tallow and old leather. Past the thick wooden door inside the scriptorium, there's barely a sound. Just the whisper of quills scratching parchment. No buzzing phones, no clicky keyboards. Just a monk hunched over his desk muttering Latin under his breath and praying the ink doesn't smudge before compline. You probably won't survive this. Your spine would scream after 15 minutes on these backless benches, and your eyes would tap out from trying to align every Gothic letter to an invisible grid. Yet somehow this slow, silent world produced some of the most beautiful books in human history. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step inside the stone chamber lit only by flickering candlelight, and maybe a high narrow window that lets in a sliver of moon. The walls don't speak, but they hold centuries of secrets. Cold air breathes down your neck like a ghost with bad circulation. You pause, trying not to sneeze. Dust. Old vellum dust. The kind that's been floating here since before your great-great-greats were even thoughts. A dozen desks face the walls like naughty schoolchildren. Monks sit in stiff stillness wrapped in brown wool robes with deep hoods pulled low. You notice one twitching slightly, probably a cramp. Another dips a quill into dark ink, lifts it, and pauses. You hold your breath with him. Will it blot? It doesn't. That little victory, one letter cleanly drawn, might be the highlight of his day. It's past matins, and before lauds, a strange hour when the world outside is asleep. But in here, the rhythm of work and prayer never stops. The scriptorium is sacred, but also surprisingly bureaucratic. Monks weren't just scribes for the fun of it. They were copying holy texts, treatises, histories, and manuals with all the joy of filling out tax forms in triplicate. Except their tax forms had to look like art, because every copied text was both a devotional act and a display of the monastery's intellectual clout. Historians still argue whether every monk truly saw his work as a divine calling, or if some were just trying to avoid plowing frozen fields at dawn. Either way, once you entered the scriptorium, you surrendered to the rules of silence, precision, and very cold fingers. One historical fact we know for sure: the rule of Saint Benedict, a 6th century guide to monastic life, didn't require book copying, but it praised manual labor and quiet contemplation. So, scribal work became a kind of spiritual CrossFit. Mentally draining, physically punishing, and somehow satisfying if you squinted just right. Quirky fact: some scriptoriums hired lay scribes outside professionals who weren't monks at all. Outsourcing existed in the Middle Ages, too. If you wanted that psalter done fast, you found the medieval equivalent of a freelance graphic designer. They just didn't get coffee breaks, or decent pay, or, sunlight. You shuffle closer and peer at one parchment sheet. It's luminous, faintly golden, where candlelight hits the calfskin. Smooth, almost silky. You imagine how many hours it took just to prep this single sheet, let alone fill it with looping calligraphy and microscopic Latin abbreviations. Don't worry, you're not expected to read it. Even other monks sometimes struggled. That's part of the point. Script as gatekeeper. Script as sacred veil. You hear a cough. It echoes loud against the stone. A few heads lift brows arching beneath hoods, but no one speaks. Silence is discipline. Speech is distraction. A slip of the tongue might lead to a slip of the pen and a week of corrections. Some monks are lucky enough to have a window seat by window. We mean a narrow slit that lets in just enough daylight to guilt you for blinking. Others hunch beneath flickering tallow candles. The light is orange sputtering. Not ideal for eyesight, which is probably why so many scribes had the vision of overworked mole rats by the age of 30. You notice something scratched lightly into the wood of one desk, a tiny doodle. A grinning face with bug eyes. That monk, centuries ago, had a moment of rebellion. A giggle in the silence. You love him already. Behind you a door creaks open and in steps the master of the scriptorium. Tall, thin, and, if we're honest, kind of terrifying. He inspects the rows, nods silently at a newly finished folio, then frowns at someone's slightly askew margin. You feel the tension ripple. That's going to be a lecture later. Maybe even penance. You imagine, "Forgive me, Father, for my rubrication was crooked." There's a smell now, hot wax and damp wool. You're getting used to it. There's no heat except body heat, and you feel it pooling faintly around the desks like warmth clinging to shared purpose. These monks aren't just copying, they're preserving. Every letter, every flourish, every golden initial is a stand against time-fire forgetfulness. You glance at the floor. Stone. Cracked. Worn down in spots by centuries of shuffling feet and dropped quills. You wonder if anyone's ever found a long-lost manuscript beneath the floorboards. A mystery novel waiting to be discovered under sacred chants and cold ash. Probably not, but it's a fun thought to have at 2:17 a.m., halfway between history and dream. The master leaves. A sigh escapes. Not loud, but just enough that everyone else feels it. You settle in beside a monk who hasn't looked up in hours. His quill dances. He's in the zone. Total flow. Medieval Zen. The words may be ancient, but the feeling is familiar. You've been here too late at night, fingers flying over a keyboard lost in a story. Except he has no spell check. Just a knife for scraping mistakes. And way more Latin. The bell rings. Not the kind of bell that makes you think of cupcakes or recess. No. This one is deep and echoing, dragging itself through the cold corridors of stone like a lazy dragon waking up. It's lauds, the morning prayer. The monks rise slowly, some stiffly, others with the ease of muscle memory. The scriptorium is abandoned for now, but you can still feel its pulse ink drying mid-sentence on the pages. You follow them. You shuffle behind their robed forms through the chilly cloister feet, whispering over worn flagstones. No one's talking. No one's even coughing now. The bell is like a spell, and you're caught in it too. Monastic life is ruled by time, but not in the way you know it. No clocks, no calendars covered in cats. Just the divine office, the fixed set of prayers that divide the day into sacred chunks. Matins, lauds prime. Terce sext. None, vespers compline. Yes, that's 8, because if you're going to commit to spiritual discipline, you might as well overachieve. They reach the chapel. It's dim, but a few rays of dawn light sneak through stained glass, smudging the walls with sleepy color. You slip into a back pew, grateful for the reprieve from the cold. The chant begins. It's low, steady, and mesmerizing. Latin syllables ripple through the air like breath on glass. You might not understand the words, but you feel them. These are the same sounds that echoed here 500, maybe 800 years ago. Time folds in on itself, and for a moment you're not sure what century you're in. One fact that's as solid as the stones monasteries ran like clockwork because they had to. The monks' lives revolved around ora et labora, pray and work. But in between prayer and labor, they found moments to read, to copy, to preserve the written word. It wasn't just about faith, it was also about knowledge. Literacy was a holy duty and sometimes a quiet power move. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The monks returned to their cells or the refectory. Breakfast is as glamorous as you'd expect. Maybe some bread, a little cheese, something that could optimistically be called stew. One monk looks suspiciously at his spoon like it has personally offended him. You relate. Eventually, they drift back to their workstations and you follow. The scriptorium feels warmer now. Maybe it's the sun filtering in. Maybe it's the collective body heat of silent determination. Either way, you're glad to be back. You pass a wooden board hanging by the door with little tokens or tiles. These are tabulae that help track who's allowed to work where. It's like medieval hot desking, except your desk comes with a candle stub and a dried-up ink pot. One young monk sighs before sitting. You recognize him from earlier, the one whose quill danced like it was doing interpretive ballet. Now his shoulders sag. Maybe he has a particularly difficult text today. Or maybe he just got assigned to copy canon law again. You wouldn't be thrilled either. Here's a quirky bit: monks sometimes sang the texts aloud as they copied them. Not full-throated solos, but soft murmurs, half chant, half mumble. This wasn't just for fun, though the acoustics were chef's kiss. It helped with memory and rhythm. You try it in your head. In principio erit verbum. Yeah, you'd probably get caught humming too loudly and be sent to weed the garden in penance. The day continues in segments. Bell, prayer, work, silence. You're surprised how comforting the repetition becomes. It's like living inside a lullaby with calligraphy. Historians still argue whether monks enjoyed this strict schedule or endured it. Did they find peace in structure, or did they lie awake at night dreaming of escape routes and hot baths? The truth is probably a messy blend of both. You wander toward the back of the scriptorium. Here, older monks, grizzled veterans of ink and discipline, sit at slightly larger desks. They're working on illuminated manuscripts. Real masterpieces. Gold leaf glints like tiny sunrises. Colors bloom from natural pigments, ground lapis for blue oak gall ink, for black vermilion, for red. It's like watching a slow-motion fireworks show where the explosions take days to form. One monk carefully dots a single I. It takes him 7 full seconds. You try not to blink. He doesn't mess up. Some monks took entire years to complete one book. Think about that the next time your Wi-Fi stutters and you declare the end of civilization. Outside, a bird sings, just one. You barely hear it through the thick stone walls, but it's there a reminder that life outside moves differently. Faster, noisier, less still. You notice something scrawled faintly into the waxy underside of one monk's desk lid. A single Latin line, O Domine, libera me de labore scriptori. O Lord, deliver me from the work of the scriptorium. You smile. There it is again, the blend of reverence and exhaustion. These weren't mystical superhumans. They were people. People who yawned, got bored, made jokes, and got ink on their sleeves. People who spent their lives writing words they might never read again. It's terse now, mid-morning prayers. Another bell. You're learning the rhythm, too. You rise with the monks, your legs a little stiff from crouching beside them for so long. As you walk the stone halls again, you hear murmurs of the psalms echoing in unison, rising like warm breath into the cold ceiling. You wonder how many years this routine has played out exactly the same way. Different monks, same prayers, same pages copied again and again. Not because they were forgotten, but because memory itself needed reinforcement. And here you are, centuries later, listening for their footsteps, tracing their ink trails, wondering what it felt like to write something you believed could outlast time. Spoiler, they were right. You're back in the scriptorium, and this time, you're eyeing the workbench like a detective. It's not just a desk. It's a command center, a battlefield, a miracle station. You crouch down next to it, squinting at the objects neatly arranged on the worn surface. They look like the leftovers from a very confused arts and crafts session, but each one is key to the scribe's sacred mission. Let's talk tools. First, the quill. Yes, it's a feather. But not just any feather. This isn't some sad pigeon donation. Scribes were picky. Goose feathers were most popular, but swan or raven could make you look extra prestigious medieval flexing at its finest. And only the flight feathers would do the strong ones from the left wing for right-handed writers, so the curve pointed away from the face. It's the little things. You watch as one monk pulls out a small penknife, not for defense, but to reshape his quill. The tip wears down fast, and he has to keep it just so sharp-angled with a perfect split for ink flow. He tests it with a few strokes on scrap parchment. Satisfying little scratches. Good to go. Then there's the ink. It looks black, but it glints a bit red in the light. That's iron gall ink, the lifeblood of medieval manuscripts, made from oak galls, tree tumors, fun fact, iron salts, and gum arabic. Smells metallic. Lasts forever. Also mildly corrosive, which is a choice. Some monks added secret recipes to make their ink better. One even suggested a dash of wine or vinegar. Historians still argue whether this was actual science or just a bored monk playing potion master. Nearby, you spot a pumice stone. Not for scrubbing elbows, but for prepping the parchment. It smooths the surface, erases rough spots, and sometimes polishes away mistakes. If the skin's too oily, the ink won't stick. If it's too dry, the ink bleeds. It's a Goldilocks situation, and you're sweating just watching it. Another quirky tool, a stylus of bone or metal used to trace guidelines. No printed ruled paper here. Monks marked out faint lines by scoring the parchment, giving them invisible tracks to follow. It's subtle, but if you tilt the page just right, you can see them perfectly measured rows waiting for letters to march across. And then there's the ink horn, a little container strapped to the belt holding that precious liquid. Portable, practical, and probably the source of at least one tragic laundry incident per decade. One monk is using a drying board, a flat piece of wood covered in fine sand or chalk dust. He lightly sprinkles it over the wet ink and gently blows it away. It's the medieval version of shaking your notebook dry without smudging your entire essay. You're starting to realize something. This setup is part science lab, part meditation altar. Every tool has to be cleaned, sharpened, and handled with care. A single blot could ruin hours of work. A shaky hand could throw off a page's alignment. This isn't just writing, it's choreography. And still, despite all this control, the environment refuses to cooperate. It's cold. The candles flicker at the slightest breeze. One monk sneezes and quickly mutters a prayer not for health, but probably because he just splattered ink. Again, you glance under one bench and spot a basket filled with quill stumps, tiny feather bits with chewed ends. Stress snacks, basically. You imagine a particularly grumpy scribe gnawing on one during a long session of translating Deuteronomy. There's also a curious little device that looks like a tiny rolling pin, It's a burnisher used to press gold leaf into illuminated pages. Sometimes it's smooth agate, sometimes a dog's tooth set into a wooden handle. Yes, really. A literal dog tooth. Nobody ever said monks didn't improvise. You lean in close as one monk dips his quill and begins a fresh line. The letters blossom onto the page with eerie precision, each stroke deliberate, graceful, and somehow faster than you'd expect. He moves his wrist like a dancer's foot across a stage. You're hypnotized, but then he pauses. His head tilts. He's run into something tricky. A smudge of ink. A mistake you watch as he carefully pulls out his penknife again and begins gently scraping the parchment. The ink lifts in slow curls. A second chance surgically granted. Not all mistakes could be fixed this way. Some pages were so precious that even a small error could lead to the entire sheet being discarded, or the text awkwardly squeezed into the margin like a panicked footnote. One particularly famous manuscript has a correction in red that says, "I wrote this wrong on purpose." Bold move, Brother Thomas. You shuffle over to a different desk, this one littered with pigment shells. Crushed minerals, ground plants, even insects all turned into paint for illuminated letters and tiny illustrations. That blue that looks like the sky on a perfect spring morning, it's lapis lazuli hauled in from Afghanistan. So yes, that one capital E cost more than your rent. One monk mixes paint using a rabbit hair brush. He hums under his breath. You get the feeling he's the artistic type. His pages are full of flourishes and gold dots that serve no functional purpose whatsoever. Aesthetic over utility proof that even in strict monastic silence a little flair survives. Historians still argue whether these decorative touches were acts of devotion or quiet rebellion. Maybe both. A way to say yes. I'll copy this gospel line by line, but I will make the Q look like a dragon, and you can't stop me. There's something deeply human about it all. The tools are primitive by your standards, yet the result is timeless. Each page, each letter, each pigment drop is a conversation with the future. And somehow, centuries later, you're listening. You run a finger over the edge of a finished folio. It's cool and slightly raised from the ink. The letters feel alive. They were made to last, not just to survive fires, floods, and neglect, but to whisper, "Someone once cared enough to make me beautiful." The monk nearby glances up, briefly sees you, and gives the faintest smirk, as if to say, "Took you long enough to notice." You nod back a silent agreement between two worlds. The door creaks open, and in walks someone different. You spot him right away, not because he's flashy, but because he's not quite a monk. His robe's a little lighter, his posture more upright, and his eyes dart around the scriptorium like he's scanning for secrets. He doesn't settle into a desk. Instead, he heads for the cabinet in the back, unlocks it with a heavy iron key, and pulls out a bundle of parchment rolls wrapped in linen. Meet the librarian. Every monastery had one. Not just someone who shelved books alphabetically and scowled at noisy patrons, but a guardian of knowledge. The Armarius, as he was sometimes called, held the keys literally and figuratively to the collection of manuscripts. He oversaw the scribes, selected the texts to be copied, and managed the slow, fragile process of building a library one painstaking page at a time. You watch as he unwraps the bundle on a long table near the light. The pages inside are old, brittle, a little warped from moisture, but they breathe history. You can almost hear them sigh. This is a borrowed text, maybe from another monastery, maybe even a cathedral library miles away. Monks often lent manuscripts to each other, though very cautiously, and usually with some serious passive-aggressive warnings inked in the front. If you steal this book, may you be cursed by the angels and smitten by 1,000 boils. You know, casual stuff. Today, the librarian is prepping a copying project. A scribe will reproduce this book word for word, line for line, including, if tradition is followed, even the errors. You read that right. Medieval scribes didn't always fix mistakes in the originals. They preserved them. Because to copy a text was to honor it even its flaws. That's loyalty on a level your autocorrect will never understand. You glance over his shoulder and see the subject De Natura Rerum, on the nature of things, a collection of medical, astronomical, and herbal knowledge, equal parts science and guesswork. One section claims garlic boiled in wine can cure a headache caused by evil spirits. Worth a shot. This raises a broader question: what were monks copying? Yes, religious texts dominated. Psalters, Gospels, commentaries, the works of church fathers. But they also preserved pagan philosophy medical manuals, math, law codes, and even ancient Greek dramas translated. Of course, no one wants monks acting out Euripides in the cloister. It's one of those strange contradictions of history, while the outside world often plunged into chaos plagues, invasions that time your neighbor tried to crown himself king with a bucket, the monks were inside calmly copying Aristotle. And sometimes they got curious. A famous example is the Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino. There, monks didn't just preserve classical texts, they studied them, questioned them, added commentary. In some corners of Europe, monasticism was not just about obedience and discipline, but intellectual adventure. Historians still argue whether this curiosity was officially encouraged or quietly tolerated. Some abbots were enthusiastic patrons of learning. Others were more like stick to the Psalms, Brother Hubert, and stop asking why stars move. Meanwhile, you notice the librarian is writing a small note in the front of the manuscript, a colophon. It's not a title or a table of contents. It's more personal. Sometimes it names the scribe. Sometimes it begs for forgiveness of copying errors. One even ends with, "Writing is excessive drudgery. It crooks your back, dims your eyes, breaks your ribs." Yikes. You stretch your own back reflexively. You move along the shelves, yes, shelves, and realize something odd. There aren't that many books. Maybe a few dozen, 100 at most. In today's world, that's less than what fits on your phone. But in the medieval monastery, this was a treasure hoard. Books were heavy investments. Parchment alone was expensive, made from stretched and scraped animal skins, often sheep or calf. One medium-sized Bible could take hundreds of skins. It makes you look at that leather jacket a little differently, doesn't it? Some monasteries tried to produce their own parchment. Others imported it. And some were forced to reuse old ones. These recycled pages are called palimpsests, where earlier writing was scraped away so new text could be added. With modern tech, we can now read some of the erased layers, uncovering ghost texts beneath the visible ones. It's like digital archaeology, and a great plot device if you ever write a monastic mystery novel. The librarian picks up a candle and starts inspecting another volume's spine. This one's been rebound recently with thick leather and sturdy stitching. You get the sense it's a prized possession. You peek inside Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Deep stuff. Written by a Roman philosopher while awaiting execution. Great bedtime read. You wonder what the monks thought while copying it. Did they agree, disagree, get bored halfway through? Did they smile at the part where Lady Philosophy smacks Boethius upside the metaphorical head? You suspect they did. You pause by a window. Outside, the world looks different now, brighter, more alive. The chanting continues faintly in the distance, but here in the scriptorium the silence is so dense you feel like you could carve it with a stylus. There's something strangely moving about watching all this unfold. These men spent their lives laboring over texts they didn't write in languages they barely spoke, preserving ideas they couldn't always test. And yet, they did it anyway. Not for glory, not for likes, not even always for belief. Sometimes they copied because they had to, because the world forgets too easily, because memory, if not inked and preserved, drifts away like smoke. One monk taps his parchment gently, checking if it's dry. Satisfied, he moves to the next folio, realigns his quill, and continues. The sound is soft, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. Somewhere far away, a future reader opens a page and finds his name. And, for just a moment, just one time, folds again. The days in the scriptorium are long, but the nights. That's where it gets interesting. You're up past Compline, now the final prayer of the day, and the monastery is cloaked in near total silence. The air feels thick, like it's holding its breath. Most monks are already asleep or trying to sleep on straw mattresses that sound about as comfortable as lying on a bag of onions. But here you are, still wandering the quiet halls drawn back to the flickering glow behind the scriptorium door. Because not everyone stops writing after dark. Inside, one lone figure sits hunched over a page lit only by a sputtering oil lamp. His face is half-shadowed, half-focused, and he's muttering under his breath. Maybe a prayer, maybe a mnemonic, maybe a curse aimed at the last letter he had to rewrite 4 times. Who can say? This is the world of the night scribe. Night writing wasn't typical. It strained the eyes, risked fire, and made mistakes more likely, but sometimes it happened. When the scriptorium was behind schedule, when an abbot had a deadline, when a special manuscript demanded urgency, or maybe just maybe because some monks liked the solitude, the peace, the magic of working while the world slept. You ease into a corner and watch him work. It's mesmerizing. Each letter emerges from the page like it's blooming unfurling from the quill with delicate precision. The ink glows slightly amber in the lamplight. There's a quiet, rhythmic scrape as the quill glides across the parchment, a sound you're beginning to crave. Suddenly, he stops. You tense. Did he make a mistake? Nope, he's just stretching. Slowly rolls his shoulders, cracks his knuckles quietly, then reaches to his side for a small flask. You hope it's water, but based on the dreamy look on his face after sipping, you're not ruling out honeyed wine. Who's going to tell on him? You night scribes often kept unconventional habits. Some were insomniacs. Others claimed the Holy Spirit spoke more clearly under moonlight. One even wrote in his colophon, "The night makes clearer what day makes noisy." Poetic, a little edgy, monastic goth vibes. And the night does strange things to your perception. You start to notice how the candlelight dances across the ink, making it shimmer like metal. The shadows around the scribe begin to feel like they're leaning in, watching with you. It's not creepy, it's cozy. Like the page is holding secrets only the dark can unlock. The scribe turns the page, revealing the start of a new chapter. But this one's different. The capital letter is enormous, ornate, filled with vines and tiny birds, an illuminated initial halfway between writing and painting. You lean closer, and that's when you spot it. Tucked into the corner of the letter is a tiny face, smiling. Definitely not a saint. More like a goblin. Or maybe it's a monk with exaggerated ears. Whatever it is, it's not official theology. It's a marginal doodle, and it's glorious. Monks had a sense of humor after all, and sometimes after hours of perfect script they cracked. These doodles, called drolleries, ranged from playful to downright bizarre. Monkeys playing bagpipes, snails jousting with knights, a fox dressed as a priest, a nun harvesting, something suspiciously shaped like male anatomy. And yes, that's real. Historians still argue whether these were inside jokes, spiritual allegories, or just the medieval version of losing your mind halfway through a project. The scribe you're watching doesn't smirk. He just keeps writing. But you suspect he's hiding a grin. Maybe he's the monastery prankster, or maybe he's just bored out of his tonsured skull. You drift along the wall, running your fingers over the stone. It's cold, rough grounding. Outside the small window, the moon rises slowly, casting silver over the courtyard. Somewhere in the dormitory, a monk snores. The night scribe flips another page. This one contains a rubric instructions or notes written in red ink. The term comes from the Latin rubrica, meaning red ochre. Red was used for headings, liturgical cues, and occasionally just to make something look fancy. Creating it required different pigment, usually from red lead or crushed cinnabar, and mixing it was finicky. One wrong balance and it faded over time, or worse, corroded the page. Still, monks used it with flair. You once saw a manuscript where the entire page was red script with gold outlines. The monk who wrote that probably had hand cramps until Pentecost. There's a scholarly debate about whether certain night scribes were entrusted with more creative freedom, allowed to experiment with layout or flourish styles, under the assumption that no one was watching too closely. Some argue these quiet hours produced the most expressive pages of all. Others say it's coincidence or selection bias in what survived. Either way, it's a romantic idea that the monk who copied scripture by day might become a low-key artist after sunset. The scribe finishes his current folio, then carefully places it in a stack weighted down with a small carved stone, his own little paperweight guardian. He stifles a yawn, wipes the ink from his quill, and begins preparing the parchment for tomorrow. You expect him to snuff out the lamp and leave. He doesn't. Instead, he pulls a narrow piece of scrap parchment from beneath the desk and begins writing something different. The style is looser, quicker. He's not worried about perfect spacing or rubrication. Whatever this is, it's private. A letter. A poem. A secret message you'll never know. He folds it quickly and tucks it inside the sleeve of his robe. Maybe it's a prayer. Maybe it's a joke. Maybe it's his grocery list for the abbot, which includes more ink, fewer fish. But in that moment, you realize something profound. This scribe isn't just a copying machine. He's a person, with preferences, with frustrations, with moments of pride and boredom and wonder. He lives in a world of silence, but his thoughts are loud. And as he finally stands, stretching again, he glances toward you. Doesn't speak, just gives a slow nod. Then he extinguishes the lamp. Darkness falls like a curtain, and the scriptorium sleeps. You wake to the soft rustle of pages and the low hum of morning chants drifting through a slit window. The monastery is breathing again. It's a new day, and your bones ache like you've been sleeping on flagstones. Because, well, you have. Don't worry, it builds character. Back in the scriptorium, the sun filters in like melted gold, casting long slats of light across the desks. And you notice something new. A monk standing at the front holding up a bound manuscript like it's a sacred relic. Which, here it sort of is. Today's a big deal. It's manuscript inspection day. Each book must be reviewed before it officially joins the library. And let me tell you, monks took quality control very seriously. One crooked margin, recopy. One smudged rubric, try again, Brother Edwin. You can almost hear the sighs echoing through time. You settle in a corner watching as the monk flips slowly through the folios. Every page gets a critical eye. He's checking the spacing, the alignment, the ink tone. Is the script consistent? Did the illuminator color inside the lines? Are the marginalia too spicy? It's basically medieval peer review only, with less passive-aggressive footnotes and more chanting. The idea was simple. No book leaves the scriptorium until it's perfect. Or, well, close enough. Perfection is tricky when you're working with hand-stretched animal skin, hand-carved pens, and a lighting system powered by the sun and sheer willpower. But they got shockingly close. You lean forward, studying the manuscript. This one's a book of hours, a devotional text for lay people. It's personalized, commissioned by a local noblewoman, judging by the inclusion of her name in the prayers. That's right, some monasteries didn't just write for themselves. They took outside commissions like holy freelancers. And those commissions, they helped pay the bills. Scriptoriums were expensive to run. Ink parchment pigments, they didn't just grow on trees. Okay, gall ink sort of did, but you get the point. Wealthy patrons could request copies of Psalms, biographies of saints, or customized prayer books, complete with their family coat of arms illuminated in shimmering gold leaf. If Etsy had existed in the 12th century, monks would have cleaned up. The inspection monk pauses on a particularly elaborate page, a miniature depicting the Annunciation. Mary's face is tender awash in subtle blush, and Gabriel's wings shimmer with meticulous brushwork. You can see the care, the patience, the fine brush that must have been made from squirrel hair. Because, yes, squirrel hair was prime bristle material. So, next time you complain about bad tools, remember Brother Elfric making miracles with what's essentially a rodent paintbrush. Historians still argue whether monks were taught illumination formally, or if it was more of a learn by copying what looks fancy kind of vibe. Some monasteries had dedicated illuminators, while in others scribes dabbled in decoration themselves. You suspect a bit of both. Like a medieval version of everyone's expected to pitch in, even if your winged cherub looks more like a startled turnip. As the inspection continues, you notice something oddly charming. The margins of this manuscript are sprinkled with tiny hand-drawn hands, little index fingers, pointing to important lines of text. They're called manicules, and they're the medieval version of a highlighter. One even has a ring on its pinky. Fashionable little guy. Of course, not every manuscript passed inspection unscathed. Some needed corrections. That's where glosses came in small notes in the margins, sometimes correcting an error, sometimes offering commentary. Monks loved glossing. They could fill entire margins with dense Latin often harder to read than the original text. You'd think they were getting paid by the word. They weren't. They were getting paid in penance and porridge. You step closer to another scribe who's working on a correction now. He gently scrapes a line of ink from the parchment with a tiny blade. Parchment is forgiving, like that you can erase if you're careful. Still, you wonder how many times he had to scrape the same line before muttering something unholy under his breath. Quietly, of course. Monks weren't known for screaming tantrums, just tight-lipped seething. Sometimes, rather than erase, they'd strike through the error and write the correction above the line. Or add a symbol in the margin directing the reader to a footnote. You know, a medieval asterisk. You can almost hear the exasperated sigh. See correction in left margin, because Brother Martin forgot how to spell Jerusalem for the 5th time. You find yourself admiring their discipline, their meticulousness, their sheer tenacity. This wasn't a job you could rush. It was an act of devotion. Each letter was a prayer. Each page a labor of love, or at least patient tolerance. And even after the writing was done, there were still pages to dry bindings, to stitch covers, to press clasps, to attach. Some manuscripts took years to complete. Imagine writing your favorite novel by hand, decorating every chapter heading, and then sewing the entire thing together before you could read it. These monks weren't just preserving texts. They were building books, physical, beautiful artifacts meant to last generations. And despite all this effort, sometimes things still went hilariously wrong. There's a surviving manuscript with a margin note that reads, "I don't know what this says. The text was too smudged." Another includes a passive-aggressive complaint. "This book was copied during a hard winter. My fingers are frozen. Pray for me." And, perhaps best of all, one monk copied the same line twice and then left a note blaming it on being distracted by singing. Relatable. The inspection ends with a nod. The manuscript passes. The scribe bows. The manuscript is carried reverently to the library, ready to be shelved or chained if the monks are worried about sticky fingers. Yes, some books were literally chained to the wall like precious prisoners. You don't trust people with $100 textbooks. They didn't trust people with 500-hour handwritten gospels. You watch as the book disappears into the shadows of the library, taking its place among the other silent treasures. And you think every book you've ever read, every idea you've casually Googled or streamed somewhere in its ancestry, a monk probably touched it, copied it, preserved it with ink-stained fingers and eyes half-closed with fatigue. All so someone someday could hold it in their hands. Maybe someone like you. The morning has matured into a steady golden hush, and the scriptorium breathes with quiet purpose. You wander past the desks, each one a stage for silent drama. Ink blots, half-formed letters, glances toward the heavens like, "Really, Lord?" Another page, but now your curiosity turns toward a question that's been tapping at the back of your mind, like a restless quill who exactly decides what gets copied. It's not like monks were just picking their favorite beach reads off a dusty scroll shelf. There was a whole system, a chain of command stretching from abbots to librarians to the lowly scribe hunched over his inkstone. Let's say you're an abbot. You've got a monastery to run land, to manage sins, to confess wine, to bless. And somewhere in your weekly checklist, sandwiched between repair sheep pen and avoid heresy, is the task of curating knowledge. Deciding which texts are worth your monk's time and your monastery's precious resources. So you convene a little council. Maybe it's just you and the head librarian. Maybe you invite the prior for spice. Either way, you've got choices to make. Do you prioritize theology? Augustine, Jerome Bede. Do you copy practical manuals, herbals, bestiaries, calendars, dream guides? What about poetry, philosophy? That juicy Roman satire, one of the younger monks swears, is just for reference. The answer most of the time is whatever serves the soul and doesn't get you excommunicated. Scriptoriums had an ideological mission. They weren't just preserving knowledge, they were curating truth as they understood it. That meant sacred texts, sure, but also works that explained nature, guided moral behavior, or recorded history in a way that reinforced divine order. If a text had survived centuries, it was often because someone believed it served God, or at least didn't tick him off. But the rules weren't always clear. there's an open scholarly debate about just how much discretion individual monasteries had. Some seem to go full Renaissance book talk, copying everything from love poetry to surgical manuals. Others stuck strictly to psalters and patristic texts, like they had a spiritual audit coming. And even within those limits, tastes shifted. Take bestiaries, for example. These were illustrated collections of animals, some real, some wildly not, and their moral lessons. The lion, king of beasts, represented Christ. The unicorn symbolized purity and could only be tamed by a virgin. The basilisk, which could kill with a glance, warned against pride. Kind of like your cousin Greg at family dinners. Bestiaries were wildly popular, often prioritized for copying. Not just because they were pretty and weird, though they were absolutely both, but because they taught Christian values through visual metaphors. And let's face it, monks were just as entertained by a badly drawn elephant as you are. You pause at a table where a monk is carefully outlining a serpent coiled around a tree. He's humming. Content. You glance at the caption. The snake, like the devil, whispers sweetness to hide its sting. Sounds about right. Sometimes texts were chosen because of urgency. A plague, better copy, beads, ecclesiastical history, just in case it's divine punishment. A neighboring monastery burned down. They might need replacements. A powerful noble dies. Commission a manuscript of the Gospels in his name. Texts could be political, pastoral, even practical, but they were never casual. That's not to say monks didn't have favorites. There's a story of one abbot in the 11th century who requested Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy in multiple copies, claiming it restored his spirit more than a whole night of sleep. Which, considering medieval beds, might not be saying much, but still. You imagine the quiet negotiations behind every copied page. The whispered arguments over whether Aristotle was dangerously pagan or enlightening, whether Virgil predicted Christ or just wrote really good lines about goats, whether some stories were too spicy for Christian eyes or simply required interpretive glosses. And oh, the glosses. One marginal note in a love poem reads, "This must be understood allegorically." You can almost hear the monk sweating as he wrote it. Not about actual lust, of course. It's about the soul longing for God. Totally spiritual. Nothing to see here. In fact, some scriptoriums became known for their thematic choices. One might specialize in copying sermons, another in saints' lives. A third, more academically minded, might churn out Aristotle and Plato back when the church was still feeling ambivalent about those Greek brainiacs. Your favorite would probably be the one rumored to have a stash of Roman comedies hidden under the choir stalls. For spiritual research purposes, obviously. There's also the curious case of scribal censorship. If a copied text strayed too close to heresy, or just got a little too comfortable with bodily functions, it might be quietly altered, omitted, or glossed into submission. There's one surviving manuscript where a passage from a medical text detailing female anatomy has been carefully scraped off and replaced with the word unclear. You get the sense Brother Stephen was not ready for that particular diagram. And yet, for all their caution, monks preserved a staggering range of texts. Myth, science, math, music. Recipes for ink chants for funerals, diagrams of heavenly spheres. Because deep down they weren't just guarding doctrine, they were hoarding wonder, curating the universe one page at a time. As you pass another table, you spot a monk copying a text with neat, tight script. He's transcribing Isidore of Seville's Etymologies, a sprawling 7th century encyclopedia of, well, basically everything. It defines words, explains history lists, cities, talks about animals, weather numbers. Imagine if Wikipedia wore a robe and only used Latin. Isidore's work was copied relentlessly for centuries. It was like the internet's loading screen. If your monastery had only a few books, etymologies was probably one of them. You glance over the monk's shoulder and read, "The word homo man comes from humus earth, because he was formed from the ground." Poetic, and slightly dusty. You continue your slow circuit of the room. A few younger novices are reading aloud to each other, practicing pronunciation. A senior scribe is gently redlining a margin. Someone's sharpening a quill with the focus of a monk diffusing a bomb. This isn't just copying. It's choosing, curating, gatekeeping the medieval mindscape. And every decision, every page, every tiny check mark next to a saint's name or flower-embroidered capital tells you something about what mattered to them, and maybe, just maybe, what still matters to us. You shift in your wooden seat knees, whispering their complaints to the grain beneath them. The air's grown stiller, thicker with candle smoke and the trace scent of beeswax polish because, yes, even the scriptorium gets the occasional scrub, though not much. Dust, after all, is kind of the atmosphere here. The scratching of quills has softened, replaced now with something more lyrical, a slow chant floating in from the chapel. And yet not everyone is drawn to the service. A few monks remain at their desks, utterly absorbed. What could possibly keep them from their prayers? You draw closer, and then you see it. Gold. Real, sun-caught, eye-blinding gold leaf being delicately applied to a capital D. The monk moves like he's trying not to wake a sleeping god. Which is fitting, because this isn't just decoration, it's illumination, the glimmering art form that turned ordinary books into sacred objects. Illuminated manuscripts weren't just meant to be read. They were meant to be beheld, to be adored. Think of them as medieval PowerPoint slides, only instead of charts you get angels, dragons, and the occasional vomiting demon. Applying gold leaf was a laborious process. First came the gesso, a sticky paste often made from plaster fish glue, and a bit of sugar, because apparently medieval monks also invented culinary chaos. This goop was carefully painted onto the parchment wherever gold would be laid. Once dried to just the right tackiness, sticky but not desperate, you'd press on the ultra-thin sheet of gold, then burnish it to brilliance with a smooth stone or dog's tooth. Yes, a dog's tooth. Look, medieval toolkits were resourceful. When it worked, the result was pure magic. The gold caught the candlelight, shimmered like the heavens themselves. It made the text feel alive, divine even. And when it didn't work, you could always scrape it off and sob quietly into your robes. But illumination wasn't just about gold. It was about color. Pigments, bright and wild, made from things you probably shouldn't get too close to. Take vermilion, a rich red derived from mercury sulfide. Toxic, absolutely. Gorgeous. Also, yes. Or lapis lazuli, that deep regal blue mined in what's now Afghanistan. Monasteries had to import it across continents, and it cost more than gold. Which meant, if you saw that blue in a manuscript, you knew someone had spent big. Then there was green, sometimes made from verdigris, which is just a fancy name for scraped rust from copper. And yellow from saffron, or even in a few cases urine. Don't ask. And no, we're not making a DIY tutorial. Historians still argue whether certain color choices had strict theological meaning, or if they were more about aesthetics. One theory suggests red and blue were used to balance divine love with heavenly wisdom. Another theory is simply, they looked nice. What's clear is that monks took their palettes seriously. pigments were stored like treasure-tiny pots, stoppered, and labeled, each more valuable than the average peasant's yearly income. And they weren't just used for initials or borders. Whole pages were sometimes covered in miniatures, tiny jewel-toned paintings of saints' battles or biblical scenes. You peer over a scribe's shoulder. He's painting the Nativity Mary, glowing with soft blush the baby Jesus rendered in delicate strokes. The ox and ass peeking from behind a stable wall like nosy neighbors. In the distance, the three wise men ride painted camels that look suspiciously like confused llamas. Look, anatomical accuracy wasn't always a priority. And then, oh, yes, there are the borders. Those unassuming strips of parchment edge, often filled with marginalia, and that's where things get weird. You've got monkeys jousting on snails, rabbits attacking knights, nuns harvesting interesting shaped vegetables. Sometimes it's hard to tell if the monks were making a spiritual point or just extremely bored. Maybe both. One theory is that marginalia served as a kind of private joke, a wink from the scribe to the reader. Others think they were reminders of the world's absurdity, or even allegories too weird for the main text. And still others say quite sensibly, we have no idea what's going on here, and that's okay. But those borders, wild, whimsical, and sometimes, frankly, unhinged, also highlight something important. Not all illumination was solemn. Sure, some pages glowed with divine majesty, but others danced with humor, satire, and deeply human weirdness. And in those margins you find not just faith, but personality. It wasn't just the saints who got halos. Sometimes even frogs did. And if you're wondering, yes, there's a very real manuscript featuring a knight dueling a giant snail. Scholars still debate why snails were such a recurring threat in medieval art. One theory links them to the slow, creeping force of sin. Another says they represented cowardice. A third suggests they were just funny. Which, if you've ever been chased by a garden snail, feels right. You step back, eyes adjusting to the kaleidoscope of colors. Every inch of the manuscript feels alive like a cathedral in miniature. The colors breathe, the gold flickers, the letters dance with purpose. And that's the point. Illumination wasn't just for beauty. It was a form of worship, a way to glorify God not just through prayer, but through craft. Through color and composition and detail, so fine it could only have come from devotion or possibly chronic perfectionism. Some manuscripts even ended with a flourish called the colophon, a short note from the scribe. Sometimes it was a prayer, sometimes a complaint. One famously reads, "This book was finished by a weary hand. You bet it was brother. But also bravo. You return to your spot on the bench, still warm from your earlier visit. The scriptorium has quieted once more. But in your mind, colors swirl, and miniature worlds unfold behind your eyelids. The monks may have lived in silence, but through illumination their books sang. You're back in the heart of the scriptorium, tracing the air with your eyes now, not your fingers. You've seen the gold and the pigments, the monk with the steady hand, and the brush finer than spider silk. But what about the part of the manuscript we so often skip over? The part before the words even begin. The parchment. See before any in principio erat verbum, or doodled dancing pig in the margins, there had to be something to write on. And in the Middle Ages that something wasn't paper, at least not yet. It was parchment, also known in its finest form as vellum, and it didn't grow on trees. It grew on animals. Or rather, it was animals. Usually calfskin, sheepskin, or goatskin, sometimes even squirrel if you were feeling fancy or weird. And yes, parchment is quite literally the cleaned, stretched, scraped skin of a once-living creature made blank and smooth for the ink to settle into like whispers into snow. It starts at the tannery, or, if you're a particularly ambitious monastery, a small slaughter yard just outside the cloister walls. A scribe might never see the flaying himself, lucky him, but someone had to get their hands dirty. The skin was soaked in lime water to loosen the hair, then scraped clean with a curved blade that would make a modern vegan cry. After that, it was stretched on a wooden frame, tight as a drum and dried under tension. The result, a creamy, pliable sheet that, with just the right light, still bore faint traces of veins or follicles. Monks even had a term for imperfect sheets with holes or blemishes abortive. Harsh, but accurate. Scribes were trained to write around these defects. You'll sometimes find a single word cramped between two blotches or a margin adjusted to avoid an unexpected puncture. It's oddly comforting, like even the medieval perfectionists had to make do with reality. And you can almost hear the creak of the parchment when it's turned like old leather waking from a dream. Here's a wild fringe tidbit. One 13th century manual advised checking parchment by licking it. If it stuck to your tongue, it was too oily. Which means, yes, somewhere sometime, monks were licking pages before writing scripture on them. Imagine doing that to your copy of the Gospels. Tastes a bit goatish. It'll do. Now, before you imagine this being some endless supply of free parchment, think again. Making vellum was labor-intensive and expensive. One average-sized manuscript could take dozens of skins depending on its length and size. Every page was a life, literally, and that made them precious beyond belief. There's an old saying, books were written on the flesh of the lamb and the bones of the martyr. Poetic, but also economically accurate. A large Bible could cost as much as a small house, and no one was scribbling throwaway drafts. Mistakes. Those you scraped away with a knife carefully. Too hard, and you tore the page. Too light, and the ink still bled through like a stubborn secret. You glance at a novice scribe struggling with such a correction, his tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth. A single misspelling, and he has to erase it with a pumice stone, gently rubbing the parchment surface like he's coaxing a grudge out of it. And that brings us to the ink. Let's talk about oak gall ink, the medieval scribe's black gold. It's made from a cocktail of crushed oak galls, those weird little knobby growths on trees mixed with iron salts and gum arabic. It goes on black and shiny dries matte and can last 1,000 years. Probably longer than your last phone battery. But make no mistake, this was a living ink. It could fade, react with humidity, even corrode the page if the recipe leaned too acidic. You can still see manuscripts where the ink has burned tiny holes through the parchment, like it decided to go full metal and take the book with it. Historians still debate the variations in medieval ink recipes. Some believe monasteries had unique house blends like ink sommeliers. Others think it was more improvisational, whatever galls, salts, and secret ingredients they could get their hands on that week. The quill. Ah, yes, the humble feathered wand that made all this magic possible. Usually goose or swan. Occasionally crow for the Goths among us. Each quill had to be dried hardened and then carefully cut to a nib using a penknife. That's actually where we get the term penknife, a blade used not to threaten but to shape your voice. Writing wasn't fluid. It was a dance of dips and scratches of ink, drying too fast or too slow of splotches and smudges. The parchment might pull the quill one way. The air might curl the feather another. You had to listen to the page. And yet, for all its delicacy, parchment is absurdly durable. Books made of it have survived fire, flood war, and mildew. Drop your Kindle in a puddle and it weeps itself to death. Drop a medieval codex in a moat and it just shrugs and keeps preaching. Some of the world's most famous texts, like the Book of Kells or the Codex Amiatinus, are still around, because they were written on parchment cared for like relics and cherished like children, and occasionally left behind in a dusty corner of a monastery, until someone rediscovered them centuries later and went, "Wait, this thing's from the year 800. You run your hand along the edge of a bound book, feeling the ripple of parchment beneath the binding. It's not smooth like modern paper. It's uneven. It hums with age. There's a ghost in the grain. And isn't that fitting? Because writing in the Middle Ages wasn't just communication. It was transformation, animal to page, voice to symbol, time to memory. One creature's skin stretched and blessed, and turned into a house for words that still breathe centuries later. Somewhere outside, a bell tolls. Maybe it's Vespers. Maybe it's the wind playing tricks. But here inside the scriptorium, the parchment speaks softly without needing to say a single word. You lean back carefully, because medieval benches aren't known for ergonomic support, and let your eyes wander to the far end of the scriptorium. There, perched near a shaft of late afternoon light, a monk in a slightly ink-stained habit is hunched over a manuscript. His posture's not great, but it's what he's working on that catches your attention. He's not copying a gospel. He's not illuminating a saint. He's organizing something, compiling, trimming, stitching knowledge together into something new. You've stumbled upon the quiet architects of memory, the compilers. See, not every medieval book was a straight copy. Some were anthologies, carefully curated collections of knowledge pulled from different sources stitched together like a literary patchwork quilt. And these weren't chaotic scrapbooks. They were intentional, often ingenious blends of scripture, commentary, classical philosophy, herbal remedies, weather predictions, bestiaries, and the occasional joke about flatulence. One of the most famous examples, the Florilegium, literally a gathering of flowers. These were medieval quote books packed with golden nuggets of wisdom, often grouped by theme. Want something on patience? Flip to that section. Need advice on pride. There's probably a quote from Augustine Seneca and your grumpy old abbot. You peer over the monk's shoulder. He's arranging sentences on the nature of the soul. Each quote has a neat margin note, initials of the original author. Some come from scripture, others from ancient Greeks. One, weirdly, is probably just something a previous monk once muttered while peeling onions. Compiling was no lazy man's game. You had to know the texts intimately, and you had to choose wisely, like some kind of medieval DJ sampling the greatest hits of salvation and sin. And if you think this sounds a bit like early remix culture, you're not wrong. Historians still argue whether compilers should be considered authors in the modern sense. Some say no, they were transmitters. Others argue they were creators in their own right, crafting meaning through juxtaposition. You get to decide for yourself as you watch this monk shuffle through his notes with a look of divine caffeine withdrawal. Let's take a moment to talk about glosses, another quirk of medieval manuscript culture. These are notes scribbled in the margins or between the lines, offering commentary, clarification, or alternate interpretations. It's like footnotes met graffiti and decided to get theological. Some glosses were official, like the famous glossa ordinaria, which surrounded the Bible text with a thick halo of authoritative commentary. Others were more personal. A monk might write, "This seems confusing," next to a line in Deuteronomy, or "God help me" this again during another retelling of Leviticus. One delightful fringe gloss found in a 12th century Irish manuscript simply reads, "Cold, hungry, tired, same brother, same." In a way, glosses were how monks argued with the text or with each other. They kept the conversation going across centuries. Imagine reading a book and finding in the margins a snarky note from someone who lived 800 years ago. Really. This again, you'd laugh. You'd feel less alone. Compilers often used these glosses as material. Sometimes they even reshaped the entire layout of the page to include them. One popular technique was the interlinear gloss, where the original text ran in larger letters and glosses snaked between the lines in smaller script-like commentary trying to squeeze into the conversation. It's not unlike you whispering questions as you read late into the night. Only they wrote them down. But here's the real twist. Sometimes compilers didn't just compile, they fused texts together. Two different sermons might be stitched into one new hybrid. Or a biblical passage reworded slightly to echo a pagan philosopher. This wasn't deception, it was synthesis, a spiritual mixtape. This blending created something known as a miscellany, a manuscript that contained a bit of everything. A sermon, a song, a recipe for cough syrup involving licorice root and powdered unicorn horn. Okay, probably narwhal tusk, but shh, don't ruin the magic. One miscellany famously contains a theological treatise, followed immediately by a joke about a lazy bishop and a goat. That's tone variety for you. You come across a book open to a computus, a kind of calendar and calculation system used for determining the date of Easter and other holy days. The pages are crammed with numbers, moon cycles, and astrological diagrams that look like they were scribbled by someone both deeply pious and very tired of math. Yet another section reveals a bestiary illustrated descriptions of animals both real and imaginary. The lion noble and Christ-like. The pelican, a symbol of sacrifice thanks to a totally made-up behavior involving it feeding its young with its own blood ouch. The basilisk, deadly eye contact. Medieval nature shows were a bit off. Some historians argue that compiling bestiaries and computus texts was just filler something to make use of spare pages. Others insist they had deeper spiritual value, a kind of moral zoology where animals taught virtue through metaphor. Either way, it's a hoot. And don't get started on medical manuscripts. Some contain spell-like recipes that mix saintly invocations with herbal cures and just a dash of chicken foot for texture. One particularly eyebrow-raising remedy suggests using the powdered skull of a hanged man for epilepsy. Please don't try that at home. Or anywhere. Still, there's something deeply human about these compilations. They weren't meant to be perfect. They were living documents, constantly updated, expanded, rearranged. A theological Wikipedia, if Wikipedia were written by sleepy monks with a penchant for weird animals and more patience than sense. And sometimes you'd find pages sewn in at weird angles. A recipe copied sideways. A hymn squeezed into the back cover. These weren't mistakes, they were memory at work. The human mind rendered in vellum. You notice one page half-filled, as if the compiler just stopped. Maybe he was called to prayer. Maybe he got sick. Maybe he ran out of ink and said, "Not again," for the last time. His story ends mid-thought, like a trail of breadcrumbs cut short by dusk. And that's the thing about these manuscripts, they are testaments, yes, but also journals of process. A glimpse into how minds worked, how ideas were ordered, how priorities shifted. One monk might open with theology, tuck in a few medicinal cures, and end with a love poem to the Virgin Mary that frankly reads like it could be repurposed for Valentine's Day. Another might flip that order entirely. And that's the magic. No two compilations are quite the same. Each one is a quiet cosmos. You lean back in the fading light, listening to the shuffling pages, the soft sigh of knowledge settling into form. Somewhere a bell tolls. A quill taps twice against a pot. And another compiler begins. The day outside the monastery is soft with mist, and inside the scriptorium the stillness is almost liquid, like time has thickened. You trace a gentle path down the narrow rows between desks, and now your eyes land on something curious. The words don't match the other manuscripts. They're looser, quicker, sometimes even personal. You've discovered one of the most human, intimate corners of the medieval monastic world, the marginalia. These are the scribbles, doodles, jokes, frustrations, and flights of fancy scrawled in the margins of otherwise reverent texts. They weren't supposed to be the star of the show, but they've stolen it anyway. Like a quiet side character in a movie suddenly delivering the most memorable line. Your fingers hover over a page. In the main text, a treatise on divine grace. In the margin, a tiny, furious drawing of a knight jousting a snail. Seriously, a snail. Historians still argue why that image appears so often in medieval margins. Was it symbolic of cowardice? A visual in-joke? A metaphor for spiritual struggle? Or just a monk who had had enough theology for one afternoon and felt spicy? The margins were freedom zones, places where scribes, usually chained by precision and doctrine, could let their personalities leak out like ink that refuses to stay in the lines. Sometimes they drew monsters, or rabbits wielding axes, or cats pooping in a scribe's inkwell, an image found more than once which suggests a troubling frequency of feline interference. And yes, one famous manuscript shows a monkey playing bagpipes. If that doesn't brighten your evening, I don't know what will. One mainstream historical fact. These marginalia weren't just rare Easter eggs. They were surprisingly common across many regions, especially in 13th and 14th century English and French manuscripts. Far from being flukes, they were part of the visual culture of the time. But not all marginalia were silly. Some were profoundly emotional. One monk wrote simply, "I am so tired." Another finishing the final page of a long text left behind a sigh frozen in ink. Thank God it is finished. You can feel their relief across centuries like the ghost of a high five. Another scribe, mid-copying, paused to scribble, "The lamp has gone out again." It is cold. You can picture him squinting by, sputtering candlelight fingers, stiff, cursing the long nights of winter as he presses on, faithful to his task. And here's a fringe tidbit for you. One manuscript contains an apology from a scribe who had fallen asleep and made a mistake. He admitted he was overcome by sleep and asked future readers for understanding. We don't deserve him. In some cases, marginalia weren't even from the original scribe, but from later readers. Generations of monks would inherit these books, add notes, corrections, even disagreements in the margins. Wrong one reader scrawled next to a passage. Another wrote yes, but also consider, and added a thoughtful counter-argument. It's like watching a 700-year-old Reddit thread unfold, with better handwriting. Usually. Some of the most charming marginalia come from student manuscripts. Monasteries often trained young boys in Latin and scripture, and their notebooks sometimes survived. Among the carefully copied prayers are occasional doodles, a badly drawn horse, a name repeated 100 times "we've all done it," or even fake Latin conjugations like blah blah bus when they clearly gave up. You pass one manuscript and there it is, a delicate flower drawn in the corner of a solemn homily. No commentary, just beauty for its own sake. A reminder that art and reverence were not enemies even when crammed into the same inch of vellum. Historians still debate how much of this was permitted versus quietly tolerated. Were the monks being rebellious, or were these images sanctioned forms of reflection and release? Some abbots may have turned a blind eye. Others likely frowned, then chuckled when no one was looking. You look closer at another page and find something clever. A small dragon positioned in such a way that it looks like it's breathing fire into the mouth of a saint. Whether it was intentional satire or divine fan fiction, we may never know. But the humor still flickers. And not all marginalia was visual. Many included brief poems, bits of gossip, even records of local events like eclipses, fires, or royal visits. One scribe wrote a full paragraph complaining about the bishop's recent sermon. Long, boring, and full of errors. Passive-aggressive post-it notes, medieval edition. Some even practiced code-switching, slipping between Latin and their native tongue. One Irish scribe jotted a casual note in Gaelic beside a Latin hymn, likely assuming no one would notice. Centuries later, scholars not only noticed, they chuckled and published it. A popular type of marginal addition was the pen trial, those scratchy test lines made when dipping a quill in fresh ink. But even these became little expressions of personality. I am here. The ink flows. Hic ego sum. Here I am. Quiet declarations from people we'll never meet. You pause, running your hand above one line in particular. Life is short, the book is long. No joke, no animal with a crossbow, just weary truth. But let's not pretend the margins were always sweet. Occasionally, they held curses. Not the fantasy kind, more like angry librarians. One manuscript reads, "Whoever steals this book, may he be struck down by apoplexy and die unloved." Harsh vibes, Brother Aelfric, but also fair. And then there were acrostics, secret messages spelled out by the first letter of each line. One scribe encoded his name this way, cleverly inserting it into a psalm. Others used it to mark political opinions hidden away from prying eyes. The more you look, the more the margins feel like whispers from the edges of faith. A place where humanity wriggled in alongside the divine, where the strict order of doctrine made just enough room for giggles, grumbles, and the occasional badly drawn duck. You reach a page where the ink has faded but not vanished. A single line curls in a forgotten corner. When the world ends, may I sleep through it. Not scripture, not philosophy, just a wish. The margins, you realize, weren't distractions from the sacred work, they were part of it. A safety valve, a mirror, a reminder that even in the holiest spaces people still get bored, still joke, still feel the cold and long for dinner. And so you sit back, the page glowing faintly in the lamplight, thinking not of saints or kings, but of the monk who once glanced around the scriptorium, made sure no one was looking, and drew a snail wearing a crown. You drift deeper into the scriptorium's hush, and now instead of focusing on what's inside the manuscripts, your eyes begin to notice what's on them. The gold glints. The reds seem impossibly vibrant. A certain blue looks expensive enough to fund a crusade. Welcome to the flamboyant, finicky world of illuminators, the visual poets of the medieval page. If scribes were the quiet hands behind the words, illuminators were the firecrackers in the back wielding brushes like wands and making every letter shimmer with purpose and vanity. Yes, vanity. You can't spend 3 days painting a single bird's feather without a little pride kicking in. You approach a desk where an illuminator is at work. His station is different from the scribe's. For one thing, its messier pigments, brushes, burnishers, and tiny knives are scattered in organized chaos. There's a faint, sharp smell of glue and minerals. The illuminator is bent over a piece of vellum tongue, slightly out, concentrating as if this is the Sistine Chapel. And for him, it kind of is. Tonight, he's working on a historiated initial, a giant letter Q, that will begin a psalm. Inside that Q, a miniature scene of David strumming a harp while a sheep eats his halo. It's layered, beautiful, and just a little weird. The process behind it all is pure medieval alchemy. First, the outline is pricked or penciled lightly. Then comes the gilding, applying thin sheets of gold leaf over a base glue called gesso. This is burnished to a shine so intense you'd think the page was lit from within. Literally illuminated. That's where the term comes from. One mainstream historical fact, the most prized blue pigment, ultramarine, came from lapis lazuli, imported from what is now Afghanistan. It was more valuable than gold and used sparingly. A single illuminated M in ultramarine could bankrupt a small abbey if they weren't watching their pigment budget. And here's a fun fringe tidbit. Sometimes monks would reuse bits of leftover paint by blending it into new colors, creating hues that no modern chemist can replicate exactly. That slightly muddied lilac. It's a shade known only to Brother Alwyn and time itself. Not all illumination was grand. Some manuscripts had simple red and blue rubrics, headers, or initial letters, while others were explosions of vines, animals' faces peeking from foliage, and marginal scenes of things you can't unsee. You spot one illuminator who has tucked a tiny man wrestling a goose into the corner of a page about St. Paul. Why, honestly, we stopped asking after the snail night thing. Illumination wasn't just decorative, it served a purpose. Large, colorful initials marked the start of new sections. Gilded elements drew the reader's eye to key passages. Images clarified meanings in a world where Latin comprehension was, let's say, aspirational. For many monks, a single well-placed image could unlock understanding faster than 100 lines of dense theology. But illumination was also a form of competition. Some monasteries prided themselves on their manuscript aesthetics. Wealthy patrons would commission books and expect them to dazzle. Please make sure my family crest is surrounded by vine's doves, and at least one martyr in tasteful agony, a noble might say. And the monk would nod, sigh, and prepare for 16 hours of painting miniature eyeballs. This leads us to one of the open scholarly debates: how collaborative were these illuminations? Did the scribe and the illuminator work as a team, or was it more like passing the baton in a very slow race? Some argue that certain books show such unity between word and image, they must have been planned together. Others believe it was more haphazard. Scribe finishes the words, someone else comes in later and adds the sparkle. You lean in and spot a faint pencil sketch under the finished illumination, a process called underdrawing. It's the visual whisper beneath the shouting color. Sometimes the sketch differs wildly from the final image, suggesting the illuminator changed their mind or ran out of blue again. Illuminators also signed their work in code. Very few left their actual names, but you'll find recurring styles, odd flourishes, and even hidden faces peeking out of the vines as subtle calling cards. Yes, it's me again, they seem to say. Still painting demons with 6 tongues. And oh, the demons. Medieval illuminators had a real flair for the grotesque. Long before Instagram filters, these artists were bending reality into wild shapes. Hybrid beasts, flayed souls. Angels wielding swords with anatomically confusing precision. Sometimes the horrors were theological, other times pure imagination, or trauma therapy, or maybe just Tuesday. You watch as a brush traces the final outline of a halo. It's not perfect. The gold is slightly smudged, but it glows anyway. You get the sense that perfection wasn't the point. Reverence was. Delight was. Wonder was. Some books were so heavily illuminated they were never meant to be read daily. They were display objects, ceremonial treasures brought out on holy days, held aloft like glowing relics. You wouldn't thumb through them while sipping broth. You'd process with them, chant beside them, behold them. But not every illumination aged well. Some pigments faded. Others reacted to the air, turning odd shades over time. One famous manuscript's sky blue scenes are now a swampy green like the painter lost a bet to a colorblind cousin. And then there are the unfinished ones. You find a book where the sketches were laid, the gold applied, but the color never filled in. Perhaps the artist died, or funding ran out, or the abbot changed his mind. Whatever the reason, they feel like frozen promises the party that never started. Yet there's something honest about them. You see the layers, the planning, the effort, the bones beneath the brilliance. And here's something lovely to end on. In one corner of a richly illuminated Book of Hours, a small figure has been added. It's not a saint, not a biblical hero, just a monk kneeling, hands raised. Above him floats the phrase, "Remember me." You don't know his name. You probably never will. But his gold still glows, his prayer still holds, and in the lamplight of the scriptorium, with the air still scented faintly of pigment and glue that seems like enough. The scriptorium grows quieter still, if that's even possible, and you begin to notice a rhythm in the silence, the slow scratch of quills, the shuffle of sandals, the soft sighs of tired men with cramped fingers. But now your path turns toward something different. A door slightly ajar at the back of the scriptorium. You slip through. Here is a room much less polished. Dim, cluttered, and smelling faintly of smoke ink and goat hide. You've stepped into the workshop where medieval manuscripts came into being, not from words, not from paint, but from blood, bone, and flame. This is the materials lab of the monastery. And tonight, you're going to get your hands metaphorically dirty with the unsung heroes of bookmaking, vellum ink, and pigment. Don't worry, you won't have to handle any actual intestines, but you're definitely about to think about them. Let's start with the base vellum. Not paper, not yet. Vellum is specially prepared calfskin cleaned, soaked in lime, stretched on a frame scraped with a lunellum, a half-moon blade, and dried under tension until it's thin, smooth, and just the right shade of ghostly cream. Yes, this means every medieval manuscript began with a dead animal. One manuscript, roughly one herd's worth of pages, makes that ancient cookbook feel a bit heavier, doesn't it? Mainstream historical fact, the highest quality vellum was called uterine vellum, taken from unborn or newborn calves. It was favored for deluxe books like gospel copies or kingly commissions. It's soft, thin, and eerily luminous. And yes, you just shivered a bit. Now let's talk ink, which, much like modern office coffee, had a 90% chance of ruining your day. The most common variety was iron gall ink, made from a mix of tannin-rich oak galls, iron salts like rusted nails soaked in vinegar, and gum arabic. Sounds like a potion. It kind of was. Done right, it flowed like silk and dried to a rich black sheen. Done wrong, it corroded the page or turned everything into murky brown heartbreak. Fringe tidbit. Some scribes intentionally used wine instead of water when mixing ink. Not for flavor, though, maybe that too, but because wine was cleaner than well water. So the next time someone says monks didn't know how to party, pigments were a whole other drama. Blue, as we know, was royalty-level expensive. Red often came from vermilion, made by heating mercury and sulfur yum, or red lead, which, as you might guess, was wildly toxic. Green could be made from verdigris, a lovely word for copper corrosion scraped from old bronze. It looked great and smelled awful. Yellow might come from saffron expensive or from urine-soaked cloth ash, free and traumatizing. Historians still argue whether medieval artists understood just how poisonous some of their materials were. Some sources suggest yes, and they handled them carefully. Others point to the casual way monks rubbed pigment with bare fingers and say, "Nope, no idea." One illuminator's notes casually mention red lead, giving him head pain and ghost seeing. So, business as usual. Then there were binders, the stuff that held pigment to the page. Egg whites, egg yolks, gum, Arabic honeyfish glue. If it was sticky and vaguely organic, someone tried it. In one recipe for green ink, the instructions go, boil nettles, add vinegar, spit in it thrice, and let the moon see it. Ah, yes. Science. You bend down beside a monk, now stirring a bowl of crushed minerals. He's making malachite green. His robes are already dusted in pigment, and he hums a soft chant while grinding with a mortar and pestle. It takes hours, sometimes days. Medieval paint didn't come in tubes, it came in blistered fingers and patient wrists. Here's something oddly soothing after making ink or pigment. Scribes would test it on scrap vellum, often drawing swirls, tiny dogs, or nonsense words. These test leaves sometimes survived, and they're weirdly charming. One has just the word blah written 20 times. Relatable. Now we move to quills, the elegant weapon of the monastic warrior. Goose feathers were the most common. Swan for fancy work. Crow or raven for delicate lines. The feather had to be hardened in hot sand, trimmed with a penknife. Yes, that's where the word comes from, and cut to a perfect angle. They wore out quickly, so monks kept multiple ready. Scribes might sharpen their quills 50 times a day. That's a lot of tiny knife work, and a lot of opportunities for accidental finger pokes. Monastic band-aids were probably a hot commodity. You glance at a wall lined with little pots. They hold pigments the color of forest moss dried blood storm clouds, some labeled, some not. One pot reads, "Use only if necessary." Intriguing, possibly cursed. Nearby a monk applies shell gold powdered gold mixed with fish glue painted on with a fine brush. The effect, divine shimmer. The process, agonizing. One misstep, and you waste a full day's worth of powdered treasure. You feel his stress just watching. Every book, even a small one, required teamwork. One monk might stretch vellum. Another mix pigments. Another paint. Another write. And another bind it all together with wooden boards, leather straps, and a prayer that the whole thing doesn't crack under humidity. Scholars still debate whether certain monks specialized by talent, or if all were trained in each part. Some abbeys had clear divisions of labor. Others just threw everyone at the problem like a medieval group project. which explains a lot about some lopsided initials. And here's something you didn't expect: the tools weren't all bespoke and sacred. Monks used cat whiskers for detail brushes. They reused old shoes as binding leather. One manuscript bears the outline of a chicken footprint, likely from a rogue bird running across drying ink. Even the waste had value. Trimmings of vellum became bookmarks or glue. Broken quills became scribal toothpicks. Yes, you. Waste not, want not, even in God's workshop. You step back from the scene, now eyes wide. Everything you've seen, the words, the images, the glowing pages, was built from dead calves, crushed stones, burned metals, fermented bark, and an almost unbearable amount of time. Books weren't just ideas back then. They were objects of ritual labor and sacrifice. And, as you glance at the stained hands, the scorched candle stubs, and the quiet, careful artistry in every gesture, you understand. Each manuscript was a kind of resurrection. They took the earth, the animal, the fire, and gave it voice. You step away from the pigments, the quills, the quietly bubbling glue pots, and return to the heart of the monastery's bookish soul. But now you carry a different awareness. It's not just the making of the book that fascinates you. It's the living relationship between the scribe and the page. And tonight, you get to witness that bond more intimately than ever, because you're about to observe a full day, well and night in the life of a working monastic scribe. You settle near the edge of the scriptorium, warm candlelight flickering across beams and faces. A monk named Brother Edric adjusts his robe, dips his pen, and begins. No introductions, no stretching. Just the steady exhale of a life trained to begin its silence. Let's track his day. He's up well before dawn, not by choice. Vigils, the first of 7 daily prayers, happen in the cold, dark hours, somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. You'd think a soul that sleepy couldn't focus, but Brother Edric chants psalms with quiet precision, slipping into the rhythms like their muscle memory. Because they are. Afterward, there's a bit of rest. Emphasis on bit. Then come lauds prime and terce each, with prayers readings and sometimes a dose of cold porridge. Mainstream historical fact. The Rule of Saint Benedict, written around the 6th century, outlines the structure of monastic life and influenced most Western monasteries. It prescribes a balanced schedule of prayer labor and study, leaving just enough room to avoid rebellion, but not enough to start a band. After terce, it's time for work. For Brother Edric, that means hours in the scriptorium. He starts by trimming his quill, wiping his hands, and whispering a prayer. Every task begins with intention. Even ink stirring. His current job, copying a missal, a liturgical book with the prayers and readings for Mass. The handwriting must be flawless. Not for vanity, but so that no priest stumbles mid-communion because a monk's pee looked like a donkey sneezing. Here's the thing, you might not expect it's not constant writing. The rhythm is more like this: dip, blot, write 3 words. Exhale. Pause. Think. Write again. Mistakes are corrected with a knife gently scraping the ink off the vellum. It's careful. It's meditative. It's slow. Fringe tidbit, some monks were so meticulous that they would warm their ink slightly in cold months so it flowed better and didn't clump. Brother Edric keeps his pot near a small ember stone like a medieval desk heater. Around midday comes sext, followed by a meal, usually lentils, bread, and something that was once a vegetable. If you're lucky, there's cheese. Meat, forget it. Unless someone's sick or very, very royal. After a bit of rest, it's back to the scriptorium. The afternoon is quiet but productive. This is when Edric hits his flow. He stops noticing the cramps, the cold, the world outside the margins. He's just one hand following a line, one voice echoing sacred rhythm. And it's not all divine ecstasy. Sometimes the ink smudges. Sometimes he sneezes mid-letter and ruins a full page. Sometimes a beetle walks across the parchment like it owns the place. And sometimes he just writes something truly odd in the margins, because that's a secret of scribes. They doodled. They vented. They gossiped in ink. You lean in and spot one of Edric's marginal notes from yesterday. The abbot snores like thunder. Next to it, a tiny cartoon of a monk asleep with sheep counting him. Historians still argue whether these marginalia were rebellious little acts of wit or simply a way to keep sane during endless copying. Likely both. You'd start drawing snails with swords too after your 500th, etc. But the real moment of beauty in Edric's day comes at Vespers, when the sun begins to dim and golden light filters through the cloister. He puts down his quill stands with his brothers and sings. The Gregorian chant floats through the stone arches like incense made of sound. You feel something shift. Because here's the part you've started to grasp: to be a scribe wasn't just about copying words, it was about transcribing a sacred rhythm. A life in harmony with breath, with light, with seasons, with silence. After Compline, the final prayer of the day, there's a hush that settles over the monastery like a thick woolen blanket. Edric returns to his cell. It's small, Spartan, and perfect. One bed, one stool, one candle, one stack of notes which he'll look over briefly before sleep claims him. Fringe note here, some scribes kept personal journals or books of shadows detailing dreams, illnesses, or spiritual impressions. A few even wrote down what they believed were divine visions or angelic dictations. Whether hallucination or holiness, it's hard to tell. But one margin reads simply, "A voice said you are not alone." Genuinely hard not to tear up a little at that one. And let's not forget the next morning it all begins again. Same hours, same ink, same chant, different page. Now, if you're picturing all of this as holy serene bliss, yes, parts of it were. But others were deeply human. Back pain, boredom, the temptation to rush. One monk famously wrote at the end of his work, "Writing bores me." Another, "Thank God it is finished." We've all been there. Still, there's a kind of quiet heroism in the daily grind of a monastic scribe. No audience, no applause, just ink page, pray, repeat. And in that repetition, a kind of eternity. Before you leave the scriptorium tonight, you notice something near Edric's workspace. A small piece of vellum tucked under a weight. On it a note written in flowing hand, almost like a signature. "I write what I dare not speak." And just like that, you understand a truth older than printing presses and louder than chants for some. The pen wasn't just mightier than the sword, it was a whisper of the soul inked into being. You step lightly out of the scriptorium, now your ears still echoing with whispered psalms and the soft scratch of quills. But don't head to the dormitory just yet tonight. You're taking a detour into the margins. Not just the physical margins of parchment, though there's plenty there. No, tonight you dive into the weird, witty, occasionally unhinged world of monastic marginalia. If the neat rows of text in a manuscript are the choir boys' disciplined, serious chanting the same Latin phrase 100 times, then the marginalia are the misfit cousins climbing the cloister walls in the background, whistling. And they're glorious. Let's begin with the basics. Marginalia refers to anything written or drawn in the margins of a manuscript. Some were practical notes, corrections, cross-references. But others Others were chaotic joy manifest. You peek at the page of a monk's bestiary, a noble lion illuminated in gold leaf jaws agape. And, in the margin, a rabbit riding a dog like a knight. The dog is wearing a hat. The rabbit has a spear. None of this makes sense, and none of it needs to. Mainstream historical fact. Marginalia flourished particularly in the Gothic period 12th and 14th centuries, when manuscript decoration got more elaborate and scribes had more artistic license. Many of the most famous examples come from English and French manuscripts where the line between sacred and silly got deliciously blurred. Why did they do it, historians still argue. Some say it was satire, tiny subversions poking fun at authority or religious solemnity. Others argue it was simple boredom relief during long hours of copying. One more theory, it was a way to keep readers alert, adding the visual equivalent of a "did you catch that wink?" Fringe tidbit. In the margins of one Psalter, a monk drew a nun picking lice out of a man's hair while a goat played the bagpipes. Theologically meaningful? Probably not. Emotionally cathartic? Absolutely. You move down the corridor and leaf through another manuscript, this one, a legal codex, dead serious stuff. But there, flanking a list of estate taxes, are snails jousting with knights. This wasn't a one-time joke. Snail duels are all over medieval books. Tiny armored gastropods facing off against befuddled men in full plate. Nobody knows exactly why. Some scholars think it's a metaphor for cowardice. Others think it's mocking the nobility. Or maybe the monks were making memes before memes were cool. You want more. Of course you do. There are monkeys playing church bells, naked men blowing trumpets from improbable body parts. We'll skip the anatomical specifics, archers shooting at dragons, cats with human faces, fish riding bicycles. Well, not that last one, but give it time. And the commentary. Oh, the commentary. Scribes often left notes in the margins, tiny personal windows into their lives. One writes, "It is very cold." Another, "My hand is tired." Another, "The ink is bad today." And perhaps the most iconic, "Now I've written the whole thing. For God's sake, give me a drink." You can't help but chuckle because the exhaustion transcends time. These were men of devotion, yes, but also men with stiff necks, sore eyes, and deeply sarcastic souls. Now, not all marginalia were doodles or complaints. Some were corrections. Monks would draw pointing hands called manicules to mark important lines. Others added glosses, scholarly notes, clarifications, or alternate translations. In one manuscript, a frustrated monk corrects a prior translation and adds, "Not like that, you fool." Academic peer review at its finest. There's a sort of whispered rebellion in the margins. The text is sacred, controlled, approved. But the margins. That's where the monks breathe joke, daydream rebel, and just play. You come across a truly bizarre one now. A bishop being chased by a swarm of frogs, while a fox in papal robes preaches to a flock of geese. Satire. Some kind of political commentary. Maybe. Or maybe just the 14th century equivalent of drawing your math teacher as a potato because you're over it. Another folio shows an archer aiming at a target shaped like a giant snail again, with the snails with the inscription, "Who will win? God only knows." Honestly, same. Historians still debate the purpose of marginalia with a mix of academic reverence and delighted confusion. Were they code humor, visual mnemonics, secret signs for other monks? Maybe they were all of those and sometimes none. Fringe theory alert, some believe certain marginalia may have had mystical significance. protective doodles, symbolic creatures meant to guard the page. A lion might not just be decoration, but a silent sentinel against the devil's hand. A monkey priest. Perhaps a warning not to take your office too seriously. And of course, we can't forget the grotesque's strange hybrid creatures peeking from corners. Dog-headed men, bearded fish, winged rabbits, the stuff of dreams, or nightmares, or both. These weren't random, at least not always. Medieval artists pulled from bestiaries local legends, apocryphal texts, and fever dreams probably fueled by bad cheese. The result, a visual world where anything goes as long as it fit between the margins. But here's a thing that makes you stop for a beat. In the margins of a tiny book of hours, tucked away between prayers, is a drawing of a woman giving birth surrounded by stars. It's tender raw and oddly hopeful. A quiet reminder that even in the most structured spaces humanity leaks through birth, humor, love, sarcasm. You wonder how many of those monks giggled under their breath as they inked yet another rabbit with a trumpet. How many used marginalia as a quiet rebellion against the rigid walls of duty, and how many simply loved the way a good joke brightened a heavy day. Because here's the truth, the margins were never just decorative. They were breathing room, a place to smuggle in humanity when the rest of the page bowed under sacred formality. You lean against a stone pillar now full of pages and pictures, and a deepening sense that even in a world ruled by structure, the human spirit will always find its playground. And somewhere under the quiet candle glow of the scriptorium, a monk sharpens his quill, glances over his shoulder, and draws a snail, wearing a crown, riding a pig. You smile, because honestly, why not? The candlelight flickers against the cool stone walls and you push deeper into the scriptorium's underbelly, not physically, but thematically. Tonight, you're venturing into a scribal experience that's less tidy than ink pots and illuminated margins. You're going underground into the strange-coded, sometimes supernatural world of secret symbols and hidden messages. If the tidy Latin columns are the monastery's face, this is the murmur behind the lips, the whispers in the dust, the meanings tucked where only the sharpest eyes catch them. Your fingers brush the edge of a parchment. At first glance, it's a straightforward copy of St. Augustine's Confessions. But then you notice the small triangle drawn beneath a word. A triangle. Just there. Not decorative. Not symmetrical. Just deliberate. And once you see one, your eyes begin to find more. Mainstream historical fact. Monastic scribes, particularly during the high to late Middle Ages, often embedded symbols into texts, not always for mystical reasons, but to mark ownership, indicate corrections, or subtly communicate theological nuance. These could include crosses, geometric shapes, stylized initials, or cryptic diagrams. But sometimes it goes deeper. Fringe tidbit. In a few manuscripts, particularly apocalyptic or mystical ones, researchers have found cipher alphabets, secret codes used to obscure parts of a text. These might have been used to hide controversial theological views, sensitive political commentary, or possibly esoteric rituals. Was this proto-encryption medieval spy games, or just bored monks dabbling in cryptograms? Scholars are still untangling the possibilities. You trace your finger along a column and see a small stylized fish. Not the decorative kind. This one's drawn with care mouth, slightly open tail, curved in a perfect spiral. It's the ichthys, of course, an ancient Christian symbol. But here it's paired with a star and a circle forming a rough trinity. What does it mean? Well, that's the thing. No one's entirely sure. Historians still argue whether combinations like this were coded theological affirmations or simply artistic flair taken too seriously. As you turn the pages, you encounter palindromes like Sator Arepo Tenet, Opera Rhodas hidden in margins or under illuminations. You know this one. It's one of the oldest known word squares, readable in multiple directions. It's been found on Roman walls, medieval manuscripts, even church ruins. It reads like a cryptic tongue twister, but many believe it was seen as protective, a verbal talisman. Scribes would scribble it in corners like a spell or a password for angels. Of course, not all hidden meanings were grand. Some were personal. A monk in the 13th century might hide his initials inside an illuminated capital disguised as flourishes in the vinework. Another might leave a tiny image of his own face peeking from behind a saint's robe. Yes, that's right, medieval selfies. But secret. You stop at a particularly rich manuscript. At first, you admire the gilded border the acanthus leaves spiraling into nothing. But then you notice the border isn't symmetrical, and the leaves twist, almost forming letters. And then there it is. A name. Hidden in the foliage. Mathilde. Just that. A name. Perhaps the commissioner of the book, or the scribe's muse, or a silent devotion inked into centuries of oblivion. Historians still debate whether such inclusions were acts of quiet love, or simply forms of pride. Either way, they weren't supposed to be seen, which makes finding them feel like stumbling into a private moment left open by time. You move on, pulling down another manuscript, a bestiary this time. The text is dense, moralizing, full of odd theological metaphors. But then you find a page where the Latin doesn't quite make sense. Certain letters seem oddly stylized. You read carefully and realize they form a message. An acrostic. The first letter of each line spells out, "Silence guides wisdom." And later, "Speak not." No more. Was this advice a motto or a warning? There's a shadow of Gnosticism here, that early heresy about secret knowledge and spiritual enlightenment. Some scribes were fascinated by the mystical edge of Christianity. And though the Church condemned most of it, whispers of these ideas still flickered at the edges of the page, tucked in symbols only a few would ever notice. Fringe tidbit. Some monastic communities experimented with angelic scripts, invented alphabets meant to represent divine or celestial languages. These scripts were rarely used to write full texts, but sometimes short phrases or names were transcribed in them. A few resemble later alchemical symbols, or the sigils found in Renaissance occult manuscripts. Was this early magic hidden worship, or just elaborate devotion to divine mystery? You reach for another parchment. This one, brittle, the ink faded. In the margin is a wheel lines crossing at dots in each quadrant. You've seen this before. It's a medieval rhoda, a symbolic diagram often used in mystical texts. It could represent the cosmos, the divine order, or the mind of God, or all three depending on who's interpreting it. A tiny scribble beside it says simply, "As above, so below." Now we're in deep waters. That phrase echoes through centuries of esoteric writing often associated with Hermeticism, the ancient belief that the structure of the universe is mirrored in the human soul. It's not Christian orthodoxy, but you'll find it penciled into the corners of plenty of Christian manuscripts. Historians still argue whether scribes who played with such ideas were heretics or just curious minds nudging at the edges of mystery. Of course, not every hidden message was high concept. Some monks just wanted to mess with their successors. In the back of one psalter, a scribe doodled a code and left the message. If you can read this, you owe me a cheese wheel. Hidden in Latin, of course. You step back now and realize something profound. The sacred page, so often seen as rigid and unyielding, was also a canvas of subtle rebellion, a mirror of questions too dangerous to voice, a place for personal devotion, grief, affection, humor, and curiosity, all scribbled under the radar. Tonight, you've read what you weren't meant to read. And in doing so, you've seen the monks not as faceless hands of the church, but as human beings navigating doubt and wonder just like you. A scribe in the 14th century once carved into the wood of his desk, "Words hide what hearts dare not." Maybe that's the truest sentence in the whole monastery. A slow creak follows you as you wander into one of the lesser-used side halls of the monastery. The light grows dimmer here. Dust floats lazily in the glow of a high, narrow window. You're entering a room where silence feels heavier, where the air carries something more than ink and candle smoke memory. This is where the books go to wait. Some are forgotten. Some want to stay that way. Tonight, you're not flipping through the polished pages of illuminated gospels or clean moral treatises. Tonight, you explore the haunted side of manuscripts, those that carried more than just words. Those whispered to those who dared to read them. It starts with a codex wrapped in faded velvet. You open it and pause. There's nothing obviously strange, just pages of a commentary on the Book of Revelation. Except the ink smells oddly sharp metallic even after all these centuries. And some of the pages, they hum. You lean closer. It's not sound exactly, more like pressure, like the parchment is watching you. Mainstream historical fact, some medieval manuscripts were believed to be cursed not in the Hollywood sense of flaming pentagrams and ghost monks with torches, but more in the quiet, unnerving way. Books were sacred, yes, but also powerful. And where there is power, there's fear of misusing it. Many monasteries kept certain texts under lock and key, accessible only to select brothers. Some were banned theological writings. Others were simply troubling books that gave some readers unsettling dreams or feelings of dread. One monk, in the 12th century, claimed a certain volume made his hands tremble whenever he touched it. And, just so we're clear, medieval monks weren't exactly known for overactive imaginations. These were men who copied the same prayers for decades. So, when one says a book made him sick to his stomach every time he opened it, well, you listen. Fringe tidbit. There's a manuscript found in southern France that contains a marginal note from the 13th century scrawled sideways. Do not read this aloud. It carries the breath of the dead. Scholars argue whether it was just poetic flair or if the monk had genuinely experienced something chilling. We'll let you decide. But maybe don't read this script out loud tonight, just in case. You flip a few more pages and come to something stranger, a page where the ink changes color mid-sentence. No explanation. Just a sudden shift from deep black to a reddish brown. Some historians believe it's a sign of multiple scribes. Others think it was a deliberate shift, signaling some kind of spiritual transition in the text. A handful, though, suggests something less material, like the book was reacting. Still, haunted manuscripts weren't always frightening. Some were revered. Take the Codex Gigas, also known as the Devil's Bible. Created in the early 13th century in Bohemia, it's over 3 feet long and weighs about 160 pounds. It contains the entire Bible, a calendar, magic formulas, and an enormous full-page portrait of the devil, like just chilling there between sacred texts. The legend says it was written in a single night by a monk who made a pact with the devil to save his soul. Historians, of course, say it probably took over 20 years. But here's where it gets weirder. Everyone who's owned the book has had some tragic downfall. Fires, deaths, wars. Even now, it's kept under special protection in Sweden. No one reads it casually. Historians still argue whether the Codex Gigas was intended as a warning, a display of spiritual warfare, or simply a compilation of everything the monk knew, including the devil he feared. As you tiptoe down the corridor, you notice a manuscript set apart from the rest, wrapped in a tightly knotted leather thong. Someone didn't want this one opened. Naturally, you do the opposite. Inside, you find diagrams of astrological symbols, cryptic prayers, and strange beasts not found in any known bestiary. It doesn't have a title. Some pages are written backward like a mirror script. Others are in a language no one's identified. No, you haven't accidentally summoned Dan Brown. You found something that actually exists in real life, a book that might as well be Magic the Voynich manuscript. Though it's now dated to the early 15th century, its language, images, and origin are still unsolved. Naked women bathing in strange pools, plants that don't exist, stars and wheels and roots, and no known translation. Scholars, cryptographers, even the FBI have tried to decode it. No luck. And some believe that's the point. Some monks and scribes deliberately created unreadable books not for deception, but as spiritual exercises. Imagine it copying unknown glyphs, trusting that somewhere in the mystery lay revelation. It's not about understanding, it's about surrender. You step back from the page a little dizzy. Even seemingly normal books could become haunted not by ghosts, but by memory. A scribe might write a prayer book for a monk who died before using it. A marginal note might mention a plague sweeping through the cloister. A blood stain on a psalter might be from a coughing fit or a wound or something darker. And sometimes the books themselves die. You come to a shelf of unfinished manuscripts, pages, half-written decorations never illuminated. Some are missing entire gatherings, whole chapters gone. Monks abandoned them when war came, or when famine struck, or when their hands simply failed. One page shows a line trailing off mid-word. Underneath, another hand has written, "He has passed to rest." I finish his line. That my friend is the medieval mic drop. Some monks even prepared their own death notes, tiny epilogues at the end of their work addressed to no one and everyone. One wrote, "If these words be read, let them carry my soul forward. For I am now in the quiet library of God." Whether haunted by legend, cursed by fear, or simply imbued with the sacred weight of time, these books whisper still. Not all in Latin, not all in words. So next time you hold an ancient manuscript, whether in a museum, a library, or your dreams, listen close. Something might whisper back. You're back in the scriptorium, or what's left of it. The candles have burned low. The desks are empty, and only the soft scuff of your steps breaks the hush. But now you're shifting your gaze beyond the inked page tonight. You're following the journey of the manuscripts themselves from monkish hands to modern museum glass. Because the scribes didn't just write these texts, they launched them. Like messages in bottles cast into the vast, unpredictable sea of history. Mainstream historical fact. Many medieval manuscripts had long, complicated lives. They passed from abbeys to cathedrals, into private libraries, and eventually to universities or collectors. Some were sold, some stolen, others simply abandoned during war or religious upheaval. Each one traveled further than most of their creators ever dreamed. Take, for instance, the Lindisfarne Gospels, crafted by monks in Northumbria around 700 CE. They survived Viking raids, political turmoil, and religious reform, eventually ending up at the British Library. It's a miracle the delicate calfskin pages didn't turn to dust along the way. But not all manuscripts were so lucky. You imagine one, a humble psalter carried across Europe during the Crusades, tucked in a soldier's pack. There's soot on the edges, probably from a campfire. A few wormholes pock the parchment. There's a strange stain across Psalm 42. Wine blood. You pretend not to guess. Eventually, it lands in a Florentine merchant's hands, then a bishop's, then a Parisian collector's dusty shelf. Each owner leaves their own quiet mark, a signature, a pressed flower, a marginal doodle of a rather chubby angel playing a harp. And now, it sits under temperature-controlled glass, silently watched by tourists who shuffle by unaware that they're peering at a 1,000-year game of historical hot potato. Fringe tidbit. Some manuscripts disappeared entirely for centuries, only to resurface in the most unlikely places. One copy of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy was found inside a false wall during the renovation of a Belgian farmhouse in the 1930s. Historians still argue whether it was hidden for protection or as a prank with very delayed gratification. But how exactly did these manuscripts survive? You picture the chaos, monasteries, looted libraries, burned borders redrawn with alarming regularity. Every time a monk had to decide what to save. Often, it wasn't just the glittering Gospels or kingly charters. It might be a beat-up copy of a saint's biography worn soft by daily use. Or a translation of Aristotle with crude marginal notes that turned out centuries later to be brilliant commentary. Sometimes what seemed unimportant became priceless. Of course, many manuscripts were repurposed. Parchment was expensive, so old texts were scraped clean palimpsests, they're called, and reused for newer writing. In some cases, though, traces of the original remain. Modern technology can now reveal the ghost texts beneath. Entire lost books have re-emerged this way, blinking into the digital light after centuries underground. You flip a page and it's like peeling back time. One famous palimpsest, Archimedes' treatises on mechanics and mathematics, was found underneath a medieval prayer book. The prayers were fine, but underneath groundbreaking ancient science that had been forgotten for nearly 2,000 years. Historians still argue whether the monk who scraped away Archimedes' diagrams knew what he was erasing, or whether he just needed a clean sheet for Sunday Vespers. But not all the travels were accidental. Some manuscripts were deliberately collected, hoarded, and smuggled. During the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, countless books were seized, sold, or destroyed, but some were hidden by scholars and monks who couldn't bear to see them lost. You picture a friar sliding a tiny volume into his robes, a scribe tucking a copy of Augustine's City of God into a hay cart. Quiet rebellions of ink and paper. Fast-forward wealthy collectors in the 17th and 18th centuries developed a fever for these books. They became trophies of education and taste. Some bought them purely for their gold bindings and tossed the actual pages. Others thankfully saw the value in the scribbled Latin, the careful margins, the echo of fingers that turned these pages long before. The Rothschild prayer book, glittering with late medieval illumination, was hidden from Nazis during World War II, then emerged decades later in a private auction. Its journey from monastic devotion to near destruction, and back again, is the stuff of historical legend. But not all manuscripts make it to air-conditioned display cases. Some still sit in attic trunks, church closets, or beneath creaky floorboards in places no one's looked in a century. They're waiting. not to be read, just to be seen. Fringe tidbit. One monastery in Switzerland discovered a forgotten cache of over 1,000 manuscripts behind a wall during a 20th century renovation. Some of the texts hadn't been catalogued in over 400 years. Among them, lost medical knowledge, rare translations, and a few doodles of a snail jousting a knight. Naturally, the journey of a manuscript is rarely straightforward. It's marked by chance risk and quiet luck. A spilled drink could ruin a century of work. One uninterested heir could throw a whole library on the fire. Or a single curious librarian could rescue it all. There's something poignant in that. Because while you're reading about these books have also read you. They've outlasted kingdoms' epidemics and power struggles. And still, they whisper. You touch the edge of one last page, yellowed, soft, delicate. You imagine it's a breviary, once read aloud by a monk with a voice like gravel and honey. It sat on an altar, traveled in saddlebags, maybe even smuggled under a nun's habit during a siege. Now it sits quietly in a temperature-stable vault. But tonight it's with you. These pages don't just tell stories. They are stories. And their endings haven't been written yet. There's something about the air tonight, it's hushed reverent, like even the breeze outside has paused to listen. You've seen where the manuscripts began. You've traced their quiet pilgrimage across continents, centuries, and calamities. But now, let's turn the lamp toward the present. Not the cold glass of a museum display, but the digital hum of your own screen. Because tonight you're standing at the latest threshold of the scribe's legacy, the age of preservation, digitization, and rediscovery. Mainstream historical fact. In the last few decades, institutions worldwide have launched sweeping efforts to digitize medieval manuscripts, making them accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The Vatican Library, the British Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. All these once imperial treasure chests are now becoming public reading rooms, pixel by pixel. You click a link, and suddenly you're zooming in on a 10th century copy of Bede's Ecclesiastical History. You can see the grain of the vellum, the hair follicles, even the tiniest smudge where a scribe apparently sneezed mid-sentence. Bless you, Brother Elfric. It's magic. Or at least the next best thing. You might wonder, what's the big deal? Why spend millions scanning books no one's read since before the Black Death? Well, because we've barely scratched the surface. Scholars are still uncovering new meanings, connections, and voices from these old pages. And sometimes they aren't even looking for them. Fringe tidbit. In 2017, researchers using multispectral imaging found a previously unknown medieval poem hidden beneath layers of reused parchment in a 15th century Spanish legal document. No one knows who wrote it. The verses are in Latin, and they're haunting. The last line simply reads, "Even stars forget their names." Historians still argue whether it was a lost mystical hymn, a fragment of a larger text, or a lone monk's final creative act. And it's not just scholars digging through digital libraries. AI is getting in on the act, too. Algorithms trained to recognize medieval script can now transcribe thousands of pages that would have taken lifetimes to decode by human hand alone. It's not perfect yet. There are still a few bugs. One manuscript was misread as Banana Gospel, which sounds delicious but sadly does not exist. Still, the future of manuscript studies is looking surprisingly futuristic. But this digital resurrection isn't just about access. It's about resilience. Many original manuscripts are now too fragile to handle. Some are locked away in temperature-controlled vaults, their bindings too brittle to bear more attention. Without digitization, they'd slowly fade from reach like candles flickering low. Now, you might be wondering, where do you come in? Right here. Every time someone zooms in on a manuscript online, reads the marginalia, or shares a weird doodle of a nun fighting a grasshopper, they're breathing fresh air into parchment lungs. You're helping these old souls wake up and tell their stories all over again. Some projects even invite regular folks to transcribe medieval texts. Yes, even if you don't know Latin. You can highlight the letters, compare patterns, and slowly decode what that 14th century monk was trying to say. Spoiler, it's usually about God. Or cheese. This brings us to something beautifully strange. Even now, manuscripts are still being discovered. Not just digitally, but physically. In 2021, a farmer in Poland unearthed a wax tablet notebook buried in a collapsed barn wall. Inside were lists of tools, prayers, and one very enthusiastic recipe for sour cabbage soup. The notebook dated back to the 1300s. We often think history is locked behind museum walls. But it's not. It's still out there in attics' closets and sometimes soup-stained notebooks under floorboards. You could find the next great medieval mystery while looking for your grandmother's old recipes. But it's not just about discovery, it's about connection. You remember that scribe from Section 3, the one who wrote, "I am so, so cold." He never expected anyone else to see those words. He didn't imagine you centuries later warm under your blanket listening in the dark. But here you are. That's the miracle of manuscripts. They're more than books. They're moments caught in ink, moments you now carry. Fringe tidbit. A tiny 12th century book of hours was recently found to have trace fingerprints in the margins. Likely a child's. Researchers believe a young novice might have helped his master turn the pages unknowingly, imprinting himself on history, with sticky fingers and wide eyes. That child is still there in a way, just like the monks, just like the hands that carried these books across burning cities and frozen forests. You're part of that chain now. Maybe not with goose quills and sheep parchment, but with thumbs and screens and curiosity. You're the latest reader in a line nearly 2,000 years long. No pressure. It's strange, isn't it? How the most ancient things, vellum ink, candlelight, have found a new afterlife in the glow of your phone. But the scribes wouldn't have minded. In fact, they might have been thrilled. Or slightly horrified, depending on your screen brightness. Historians still argue whether digitization is the end of manuscripts' magic or their rebirth. Will the flicker of screens ever feel as sacred as the flicker of flame? Can pixels hold the weight of centuries like parchment can? Maybe not, but maybe that's not the point. Because even as you scroll or listen or click, you're doing what the monks did. You're paying attention. You're remembering. You're witnessing. And that dear traveler of ink and code is what the manuscripts always wanted. The night deepens, and you settle back the final stretch ahead. You've traced the journey from scratchy quills and cramped hands through flickering candles and whispered prayers across centuries of turmoil and quiet devotion. You've felt the weight of manuscripts, their ink, their legends, their ghosts. Now it's time to draw the quiet curtain, to let the stories settle into the shadows of your mind. As you exhale, imagine the last echoes of that medieval scriptorium fading into silence, the faint rustle of parchment closing softly. You're holding a relic, not just a book, but a vessel of memory, fragile yet defiant, whispering to you across time. The monks who labored through countless nights never expected their scribbles to be read in the glow of LED screens, or to find new life in the hum of digital servers. They worked for faith, for learning for God. But also, unknowingly for you, someone centuries later, who would pause, listen, and wonder. Historians still argue whether the manuscripts are sacred simply because of their age or because of the humanity they carry. Maybe it's both. Maybe it's the small, imperfect hands that shaped them, the quiet breath of the past caught in each letter. You can almost feel the monk's weary fingers stiff from cold, and ink the scent of beeswax candles lingering in the air. And you can hear faint but clear the echo of their whispered hopes that what they wrote would outlive them, would speak beyond the walls of stone and time. There is a strange comfort in that thought, that through centuries of scribbles and scratches of marginal notes and secret codes you are connected, that you belong to this quiet world of manuscripts, even if only for a night. Now, as the night folds gently around you, allow the world of ink and parchment to slip softly from your thoughts. Let the flicker of candlelight dim and the distant chanting fade to silence. The stories are safe here, waiting patiently in the quiet. Rest now, knowing the manuscripts breathe with you in your dreams, in your memories. And when morning comes, the world will seem a little larger, a little richer, carrying with it the whispers of monks who wrote in the dark, so that you might one day read in the light. Sleep well, traveler. The quiet world of medieval monastic scribbles will be here when you return.